Hello and welcome to the Focal Points with Dr. Peter McCullough and John Leake. I am your host today, John Leake, and I am interviewing, I used to call him America's best newspaper journalist, but now I call him America's only newspaper journalist. Jan Jekielek at the Epoch Times. I think he's really one of the last great independent reporters that we have um, in this nation of ours. Jan, welcome to the show. We're here to talk about an extraordinary book. How are you? I guess it's busy in Washington, D.C.
Well, it's incredibly busy. We have this sort of big book launch, which the publisher dreamed up and is actually happening right now. So I'm actually embroiled in that a little bit. We have, if you can imagine 1,000, we can take 1,000 plus people into the book launch, right? Rob Schneider and I are going to be having a discussion about Kill to Order. So this is on my mind. We want to make it big. We can help it launch the book further. There's a donor who contributed. The first 1,000 people who come in the door are going to get a book on the 16th of March at Trump Kennedy Center. So anyway, it's an exciting time. And I love the fact that people are into this very, very difficult and dark issue, which frankly, for years, it was very hard for me to talk to people about because people would basically kind of clue out and leave the conversation mid conversation, right? Just because it's such a, when you realize what it is, it's so, it's an evil yet to be seen on this planet, to quote one of the key researchers on this whole issue.
Well, Jan, if you would show our audience the cover of your book,
I'd love
don't
to.
be shy. And so, Killed to Order. I will let you do a brief introduction of the book and how you got into the story, and then we'll have a conversation about it.
100%. So, well, the book is in two parts, really, right? The first part is sort of explaining what this forced organ harvesting is, how it's different from your garden variety, also horrible black market organ ring, which there are plenty of in the world, unfortunately, how it's like a whole different level. And the other part is how it's a very valuable lens for understanding how communist China actually works. And this is something that, even though we've made a lot of progress in the last 10 years on understanding that communist China is not, liberalizing and all of that kind of that narrative, false narrative, there's still I think, a lot of gaps in really understanding how they operate. It would help us in terms of developing policy and, frankly, corporate relationships or in all of this, if we did understand it. So the book has twofold purpose. Let me explain quickly this evil yet to be seen on this planet, as I describe it, as David Matus, one of the researchers, described it. You need to have a state actor. You need to have someone who can push massive coercive power into a population, okay, and propagandize a population heavily, and basically to dehumanize a large group of people and also incarcerate that group of people in huge numbers. By huge numbers, I'm saying like 1 million, maybe, or hundreds of thousands, million, maybe more people. Okay. And this is what the Chinese Communist Party did to Falun Gong practitioners back in the year 1999. Okay, there was it was a spiritual movement, very grassroots, very bottom up, people practicing truthfulness, compassion, forbearance, this kind of thing. A lot of health benefits. That's part of the reason it grew so big. 70 to 100 million people doing it, bigger than the Communist Party. Okay. And then the regime leader, Jiang Zemin, decided to crush it. And to do that, he had to kind of convince the rest of the population. 1 in 13 Chinese were basically doing this, that these are not, benevolent people practicing truth, compassion, tolerance, and kind of model citizens or whatever. They're actually evil and have nefarious agendas. And they used talking points straight out of 1930s Germany for this purpose, by the way, like just really nasty demonization type stuff. And what that set the stage for, then they incarcerated a whole lot of them, because it also turned out that, this attempt to re-educate them, the crushing it didn't mean killing everybody. It meant re-educating them, transforming them. There's all these words they use. The Chinese Communist Party has been expert over generations doing this to different groups of people it deemed as the enemy for whatever reason, right? And so basically, they incarcerated these people because they weren't actually getting re-educated and transformed very easily. It turned out that they had a lot of resilience to this. There was even an unwritten rule written in the prisons that all Falun Gong deaths will be considered suicides. Okay, and like I remember in 2005, there was a special rapporteur on torture of the UN. He was saying that half of the people in the entire incarceration system, black jails, prisons, re-education centers, all of that were Falun Gong. So like massive incarceration happened. We don't know the exact numbers. But what this set up was a situation where those people are now in massive numbers incarcerated, and they can be blood typed, tissue typed, organ scanned. Okay, why is this important? Because in a normal situation, if I need a new heart, someone has to have a catastrophic accident, okay, and they need to match me in all sorts of a myriad of different ways. Like the size has to be compatible, the blood type, histology, a whole range of things. Okay, now, but in China, this is where it gets crazy. This person, this prisoner of conscience in the prison, has already been blood typed, tissue typed, organ scanned, and they are pre-matched to you. And if you come in and you've got 200 grand in your pocket to pay for a new organ, okay, you can get that in 2 weeks. Indeed, prior to 2006, there were ads that actually said in 2 weeks you can get this new organ online. After we started publicizing this, this stuff went underground. But people are still to this day getting organs in incredibly short wait times. And that's because this person is pre-matched, and the moment you pay, that person can be killed to order to give you that heart or kidney or liver or whatever it is. This is what we're talking about, right? This is a whole different level of organ trafficking, like, the world has never seen.
Well, that's quite remarkable. I mean, how does one? I mean, this is what I think is so interesting about your story. It's the psychology of it. And, as I was reading it, it reminded me, I don't know if you're familiar with the play. It's a 1953 play by a Swiss playwright, Max. Why is his last name suddenly? It doesn't matter. It's called Biedermann and the Arsonists. Have
Mm-hmm.
you ever heard of this?
No.
Okay. Biedermann and the Arsonists. It takes place unnamed town in Switzerland or Germany in the early 50s. And a very good-natured Biedermann is the German name for like middle-class man. Like he's this honest, kind of naive guy. He's reading the newspapers and he reads a story that there are arsonists who are afoot and traveling, roaming around the countryside. And their modus operandi is to introduce themselves, ring your doorbell, introduce themselves as traveling salesmen who are caught out. There's no room in the inn. Could we spend the night in your maybe you have a free room in your apartment or your home? And the naive owner lets them in because they appear to be normal. They appear to be human. They're sort of charming, nice looking boys. They come into the house and then they set the house on fire. So Gottlieb Biedermann thinks, well, what kind of a naive person would believe that? And then next act, ding dong, he opens the door and it's these two young men. They seem human. They seem normal. They're sort of charming. They make a sort of nice, charming remark to Frau Biedermann. So he lets them in to his home. And then they go up in the attic and they set fire to his house. It catches the whole town on fire. And at the end of the play, Herr Biedermann is transported to hell, where he's confronted with these two young men. And they say, well, why did you let us into your house? Like, what were you thinking? And and when one of them says, well, I'm the devil and this is my sidekick, Beelzebub. So what was the playwright? What was the psychology? We can't believe things when they're right in front of our nose. Like this is happening. There are witnesses that are telling you that it's happening. Human beings really are capable of doing this under certain circumstances. But we read the document of it as I read your book, and you think, how could this be possible? How could human beings do? So you almost don't believe it. You think, well, the witnesses are unreliable, or the witnesses are not impartial. They have some kind of a political agenda or an axe to grind. So I think that when people read your book, they are going to have to bear in mind that Ernst Max Frisch was his name, the Max Frisch psychology of Biedermann and the arsonists. So maybe you could start by commenting on your psychology as you were doing your research. I mean, are you thinking, surely this can't be true? Like, do I need to double check my witnesses? Like, what's going on here?
This is such a fantastic question. And absolutely, when I first heard about it and, rumors about it in '05, I believe was the first time, I didn't think it was real. I thought it might be something that's, like a rumor that people who have been horribly harmed by the regime, and I knew at this point that the regime was doing horrible torture to people. I mean, they were like, throwing women naked into all male jail cells overnight to drive them insane through, sexual torture. They were, all sorts of horrible tiger benches and things I learned about, like methods of torture I wasn't aware of, so I knew that there's a lot of nasty stuff going on, but this just felt like a different level again, right? And but let me actually comment a little bit on the psychology before I tell you my own process, right? When I talked to people about this, when I realized it was true, when the whistleblowers, I was able to access the information they provided, and the research had been done by the two Davids. I'll explain who that is in a moment. That showed 17 lines of evidence that all pointed in the same direction, all circumstantial, but enough to convince me. Okay, and a lot of people, thankfully, but not enough back in 2006. When I would talk to people about this, people would leave the conversation mid conversation very often. Okay, it's like it wasn't that they were letting, like, they kind of let me in the door, right? I mean, to use this kind of like a reverse Biederman situation, but they would let me in the door. But then once they're confronted with the reality that I'm sharing, right, they would leave. Like mentally, I would see it happen, right? It was a very common thing, and I didn't feel bad in a way because I understood. Like, this is so macabre, it's so extreme, right? I get it. I felt extreme revulsion when I was starting to grasp that this is real, right? I didn't want to believe it. Who wants to believe it, right? No one wants to believe that, except perhaps a psychopath. A psychopath could believe it very easily, obviously, but but that actually has changed, and I think one of the reasons it has changed, and that's just in the last few years, I've noticed the phenomenon, right? I think that the COVID years changed things. This is just my hypothesis, okay? I think that one, we realized in the West that our, we're capable of some pretty crazy things that make no sense, that really harm society, our own society, right? I.e., like shutting down the economy without really thinking it through very well and causing all sorts of untold, generational damage. Just that, right? And then, making people, talk to their relatives, through plastic, their potentially dying relatives. They're just, we did crazy things that actually made no sense, right? But also in China, right, we saw this zero sum, extreme totalitarian mentality in full form. Like, people were being welded into their homes, right? Whether or not you're going to get any food, well, does that really matter? Anyway, you get the idea, right? Like, I think we saw both our own, sort of things going a little bit of extreme here, and then we saw that regime in action, right? What it is doing to its own people. And my hypothesis is that that's opened up people's minds somewhat to be
Well, and
to yeah.
also the weird recognition that our state, our government, I think that there's a sort of unstated, perhaps even not fully conscious on the part of our dear rulers. They kind of envy the central power of the
I
Chinese? I think they do. I think they'd love to have it.
I think that there's definitely that totalitarian impulse. I think actually that totalitarian impulse is in every society. This is just my again my hypothesis, okay? But the point is, I think the lessons of COVID for us, right? Given that the way, I mean, I think we probably will agree on this. Certainly through the data and analyses that I've seen, I actually I would say that the way the policies were implemented during COVID were worse than, like, basically if you were to implement random policies, they would have done better than the policies that were implemented. It was shocking how bad the policies were, right? So it, and I think part of that was because we indulged in this totalitarian impulse. I think one of the lessons, right, of this time, and I made this commentary years ago. It's sort of, let's say, one of these things that aged well, right? Is that um, because of the abject failure of this essentially expert rule, right, and this flirtation with this totalitarian impulse, we have the perfect case study of what not to do. We should never allow that, right? And I mean, and we have, there's been, as I've learned since, right, there people have thought about this before, right? Because experts tend to have very narrow areas of understanding. They can be very good in very one area of import, right, for a particular issue. But to have them, it doesn't make sense to have them govern because they're not going to be able to see the bigger picture, right? And sort of and factor in, like, for example, the people and the fact that closing an economy increases suicide rate dramatically, or there's any number of second, third, tertiary order effects that someone who's truly trying to do governance properly is going to have to get input from a lot of people who have a lot of expert ideas and factor them in. And the other part, by the way, is that yes, we definitely don't want to put people with totalitarian impulse in positions of power ever, right? And in a way, communist China, I think, is a lesson of that. But we don't fully grasp that. This is the thing, because the thing that communist regimes are absolutely the best at, always, all the way from the beginning, all the way from the Bolsheviks, the first one, is propaganda. They're absolute. They're top in class. Okay, and Marx was a nobody. I don't know. A lot of people don't know this. Marx was a nobody. His economic theory was completely discredited in his time. He died with two people at his funeral, if that. Nobody knew who he was. There was no, oh my God, he wrote Das Kapital and the Communist Manifesto, and everyone's, oh my God, I realized I'm oppressed. The critical consciousness has been achieved. We must struggle against the man. No, none of that happened. Okay, it was a creation of the Bolsheviks. It was a creation of Lenin to create the myth to justify their power grab and massive transfer of wealth, through communist revolution. They could have picked any number of leftist writers at the time who were doing the kind of quasi-Marxist thing, but just Marx became the hero for the
Have you
propaganda
ever,
purpose.
Jan, have you ever read that it was I believe he was um, completely incognito. I mean, a undercover agent for the Prussian security service who visited Marx at his apartment in London and then wrote a report back to Berlin about what he found. Have you ever seen that before?
No,
Oh,
no, that sounds
it's
fascinating.
it's fascinating. I mean, his description of Marx sponging off of his minor nobility wife, Jenny von Westphalen, and just kind of a drunk and this sort of unkempt guy that doesn't look after his kids. It's kind of like this sort of dark version of La Boheme. He's this kind of low life bohemian guy. It is remarkable that Lenin and his gang were able to create this religion around the Saint Carl. It's astonishing. So I completely agree with you, and I think your instinct of totalitarianism and propaganda really being hand in glove is spot on. My concern is that this totalitarian instinct, it is within all politicians, and I think there's a selective process whereby guys who are interested in that amount of power, they kind of get selected out. I mean, it's kind of like guys competing for the top in a mafia structure, the toughest, most ruthless, cunning guy, is oftentimes the one that gets to the top. I mean, we saw this with Stalin. I mean, he's the toughest and the most ruthless, ultimately takes over after Lenin's death.
Well, this is something that I actually tackle in the book quite a bit. So, in this is the interesting thing, right? In free societies, and frankly, other societies, we actually select out the psychopaths at some point. They might be more ruthless, they might be, better at certain things, but ultimately they're just pretending to play along with kind of what other human beings do, right? That's at least that's my best understanding of the reading of the literature around psychopathy and or antisocial personality disorder as it's called today, right? So even if someone's very ruthless, when they're that cold and that calculating, they get found out and sidelined because people are just, this is too crazy, right? Yes, I'm ruthless, but this is something different, right?
Yeah,
That, yeah, but let me finish
yeah.
the story. In communist societies, and this is the work of Andrzej Łobachewski, Polish psychologist, who basically, he observed the phenomenon and then wrote the book Political Ponerology about how the communist system uniquely empowers people who have these kind of traits. Okay, it's like it's something very specific to communism that it helps people rise to the top. And I can, talk a little bit about why I think that it's sort of the incentive structures are a bit different than other societies where, of course, ruthless people do well too, right? But it's like a different thing. Yeah.
Well, I agree, and partly it's because if the Bolsheviks being the most remarkable example. I mean, you read so one thing that I think is really psychologically fascinating. Read Dostoevsky's book, which was published in 1872. The title of the book is Demons, and
Hmm.
it's Dostoevsky's black satire of these wannabe revolutionaries who are bringing in ideas from Germany in the late 1860s. And I mean, Dostoevsky's such a great comic writer. He really makes fun of them. And what he reveals is that they're totally incompetent. They just speak in slogans. They haven't even read Marx. They've read Russian language Cliff's notes on Marx. They don't even really know what they're talking about. But it's a very prophetic novel, and this it's a combination of ruthlessness, high energy, low empathy, but also combined with incompetence. And I think that what makes communism particularly susceptible is you don't really have to demonstrate competence in anything. I mean, Lenin achieved nothing prior to becoming dictator of Russia, and nor did any of his young henchmen. So I think that's the crucial selective thing. You don't have to be anything but just a ruthless psychopath who is manipulative and lacking empathy, and boom, you're ready to go.
And I think there's this other element, and just sort of watching, let's call it wokeness develop in our own society. Something struck me, and again, this is actually during writing this book and contemplating Lobachevsky's work, and there's something about and James Lindsay's work, who's kind of been, sort of a decoder of this woke literature, which is just very difficult to decipher. Except for some reason, he likes to punish himself reading large amounts of it. But no, it's like basically in wokeness, if you performatively agree to certain basic, very simple things, which are actually kind of crazy, but you agree with it and you champion it, even you rise straight to the top,
Yes.
right? It's like, and this is actually this is not just in wokeness. This is, there's commonalities. There's sort of these Marxian elements. I'm not saying it's the same thing. Some people call it American communism, wokeness and so forth. Of course, there's this postmodernist aspect to it as well. That's true, but it's kind of similar. If you're happy to performatively, espouse whatever the correct talking points of the day are, or ideological thinking, or the secret password, so to speak, to get to the next stage to win, right? You, for example, even if you're applying to university, you write in certain things that you need, right, to get to the next stage, then you win. And what strikes me with some of the stuff here is that some people could never bring themselves to do it. That's probably a small proportion of the population. But for others, namely psychopaths, right? It's actually, they're participating in society in this way. They're kind of mimicking, trying to not be discovered, right? And mimicking whatever people do. But a kind of a Marxist society, or what the woke society is, a kind of a playground for people like this, right? Because it's a very simple to do the thing that is required to achieve, to get to the next stage, to kind of grow in stature. And the second part is that the thing is kind of crazy, right? So you have to kind of agree, like, for example, that the way that we deal with racism is more racism, right? That doesn't make sense. It's
It's
not like
true.
this logically doesn't logically make sense. But you kind of you're that's what you're getting on board with, right? If for example, if you're in critical race theory or whatever.
Well,
Um,
it's true, and what you say, this where you just do something just totally crazy, and it's like, yeah, well done. So when the Tsar and his family, were shuffled off to, I don't know how to pronounce it in Russian, Berg, I think is it's a town named after Catherine the Great, pretty far east. And the Tsar and his family are being held. There's kind of negotiations about, well, like, what do we do with them? Will the English take them? And some young Bolshevik, I can't remember his name, Yakov Smerdlov, I think, says, well, let's just kill them. I mean, let's just go in there with a bunch of pistols and just shoot the Tsar, as the Tsarina, and all their daughters. Like, let's just take them out. And the story is that Lenin is then informed of this. It's like almost this impulsive psychopathic decision. And he's like, well, there were white army elements that were closing on the city, and we didn't really want the Tsar's family to be kind of a rallying banner. So, well, we murdered them. And Lenin's like, okay, okay, fine. And apparently when Wilhelm II, whose government was responsible for transporting Lenin from his Swiss exile, safe transport through Germany to get in, to take over to Russia, to take over the provisional government, and then to take Russia out of the war with Germany. Wilhelm receives word, well, your second cousin and his entire family have been murdered. Wilhelm can't believe it. He's like, what? I mean, the intention wasn't to kill all of them. It was to put an end to the war. So this is the communist mind. I think we can agree on that. But we could talk communism and its discontents all day. You've got to tell us more about this book. So the organ harvesting is a state-sponsored, industrial scale. This isn't just some brigands that are breaking into people's homes and murdering them. It's systematized, it's industrialized, and you think it's still going on. You think there's been no cessation of this.
I mean, but we don't see any evidence of cessation. Like, this is, uh, I can give you kind of a few examples of evidence, right, that we looked at. One example would be, well, specifically about today, right? Organ harvesting continuing today. Ethan Gutman has a book coming out, and Ethan Gutman is one of the hero researchers that's in Kill to Order. He wrote a book called The Slaughter, which is originally, I forget how many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, he documented what had been happening. He just wrote a book called The Xinjiang Procedure, which is coming out imminently. I don't know exactly when, also on this issue. And that's the first kind of deep treatment of how the Uyghurs have been used. Okay. So because what happened was, right, they started with the Falun Gong back in 2000. Okay.
Jan, if you could just quickly 2 points of definition. So where did the Falun Gong emerge in China? Did it kind of come out of Tibet? Is there a spiritual tradition that they draw on, or is it just they come out of nowhere? And then how did they become such a large sort of spiritual community? And then who are the Uyghurs?
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for asking. Falun Gong is an ancient practice. It might be older than Buddhism as a religion, for all we know. I don't know exactly, but these traditions typically, from what I understand, are passed down kind of one teacher to one disciple, let's say, okay? So someone learns, becomes the expert, and then they impart that to the next person down the generation. They're usually, most of these practices would never even be known by most people for this reason. They're just these lineages that pass from generation to generation. Now, in 1992, a man named Li Hongzhi is the founder of Falun Gong. He popularized the practice to a broader audience. Okay, he had learned from a master himself and had actually studied under a number of other teachers as well subsequent to that. And basically, the system is one where truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance are the core principles. Okay. And it's a very unusual system in a lot of ways because it doesn't have a lot of the typical structures that would be associated with a belief system. Okay. So, for example, there's voluminous teachings about how to apply truthfulness, compassion, forbearance that Li Hongzhi has written, but there aren't a lot of rules. The rules would be something that maybe everybody would agree on that practices Falun Gong. So one of the rules is you can't enrich yourself from it in any way. There's no like treasury, or you can't collect money for teaching it or stuff like that. Okay, that's one. Another one is that there's no hierarchy in it. So there's no like priests or other kind of leaders, really, actually, right? And Li Hongzhi himself, there's no worship of the teacher or the master. That's not something that Falun Gong practitioners can do. So, and another thing, like let's say, John, you were a really, impressive Falun Gong practitioner to me, and I wanted to emulate you, right? I'm just going to copy what John does because he's awesome at truthfulness, compassion, forbearance. I can't do that. Like I actually would have to study the teachings myself and understand how to live them the way and figure it out myself. It's very self-directed, right? In a way that's almost difficult to fathom. There's even no roster. There's no membership. You don't join something. What makes you a Falun Gong practitioner is living those teachings, not some kind of membership in a group. So I actually think this is one of the reasons, right, why Falun Gong is persecuted so harshly in communist China, because I think it engenders a particular high level of agency in people. Because like the only reason you would continue being a Falun Gong practitioner is, well, you have some health benefits from it. That's certainly a lot of people experience that. There's like, tens of thousands of testimonials, probably more to that effect. But like you can leave and just do your own thing, right? And so when the regime started persecuting these people, it turned out they were also unusually resilient to these transformation practices and everything. I think exactly for the same reason. So to summarize, it's an ancient spiritual discipline that's unusually self-directed. And it actually started out in Changchun. That was the hometown of Li Hongzhi. That's where it was first introduced. And then it just kind of spread by word of mouth. Li Hongzhi only taught for about 2 years. He taught in a large lecture format. And he tried to fit into the structure. See, remember, communism is sort of obscenely hierarchical, right? So there was it was called the China Qigong Research Society that governed all these different sort of slow motion movement type practices, health related, right? And so what was really interesting, one of the first schisms between Li Hongzhi and the government was when the China Qigong Research Society was kind of demanding that basically like you had to take dues, right? And then the China Qigong Research Society would take a cut of that, right? And initially, Li Hongzhi kind of participated in this for the 2 years that he actually taught publicly. But at some point, he was like, well, this isn't actually what we're supposed to be doing. So he stopped teaching himself and he just said, look, if you like this, he told people, if you like this, spread it, share it with your friends and see, who gets interested, basically, right? And I mean, I'm kind of being glib here. That's I don't know exactly what he said, but something like that. And that's what happened. So and it by the 1999 it grew to 70 to 100 million people doing this way. But the China Qigong Research Society was really unhappy. They wanted their cut of this large population of people doing Falun Gong, but that this wasn't really part of collecting dues, wasn't really part of Falun Gong.
You know,
So yeah.
it reminds me of the Greek and then later the Roman Stoics. I mean, I think it was Epictetus. He was a slave in his youth, and he learned this forbearance, tell the truth, even when it's going to be painful, even when you're going to suffer for it, and forbearance and truth. I mean, I guess those are the two primary Stoic principles. And yeah, if somebody is really practiced in the art and the habits, the way, the Tao of Stoicism, they're going to be very resistant to totalitarian nonsense.
No,
So
absolutely. And sometimes I describe that third principle, forbearance. It's a little bit difficult. It's the Chinese character Ren, and it's not just it's tolerance of people, tolerance to pain. There's this idea of pain being a positive thing that you learn from, much as the Stoics would believe. So I think there's a kind of a stoicism there, although I don't know if anyone would translate it directly that way.
well, that's fascinating. So there's a certain cohort of the population that hears this, it resonates with them, and they begin to practice this discipline and this wisdom. When does the Chinese Communist Party, when does this growing movement hit their radar and they decide, uh-oh, we have a potential nonconformist element in our hands. We need to give these guys a hard time. When did that happen?
Well, the timing is somewhere 1997 to 1999, okay? Because, well, first of all, it's actually astonishing because, you asked, does it come from Tibet or some region? No, it doesn't. It started in Changchun, but literally every province had millions of people doing it. I mean, in Beijing alone, there were 10,000 practice sites outdoors. Remember, and there aren't like what you would call a place of worship or something. Just people would get together and practice in a park or something. So like everywhere, right? And so no, it's a kind of it's an astonishing phenomenon. And of course, at some point the government's looking at this, but even like government is giving people awards. I've seen these, right? People are getting awards for reducing healthcare costs in certain parts of the country, right? Because now they're doing this practice. It has these health benefits, and they're no longer. By the way, the health system had collapsed. I think that's part of the totalitarian health system. I think that's part of the reason it also became popular was because it had these kind of natural health benefits that a lot of people enjoyed. And it's only at some point, like he was even taught at like the headquarters of Chinese state security, like really crazy. Like I wouldn't have expected that, right? But I've seen the photos, basically. So, and at some point, I would guess it's these the totalitarian, the people with the particular totalitarian and party maintenance mindset are like, hey, what is this? Is this something, is it, we should be concerned about this thing? And actually, Jiang Zemin himself, this is what's really fascinating. You're asking about this, right? I don't actually cover this so much in the book, but Jiang Zemin, there's a lot of evidence that he started this persecution, the dictator at the time, against the advice of most of his, top people. And he even had family members who were practicing themselves, right? And again, part of the reason, typically people say 70 to 100 million is more than Communist Party members. That might seem like a threat to a communist regime, right? Obviously. But I also know as a fact that he was very jealous of Li Hongzhi as someone who had the love of millions of people, and something he could never have. And you're a much greater student of the human condition than I would know. I was a biologist, 25 years ago. I hadn't read a lot of the incredible literature that you have read. I didn't realize you're going to laugh at this, John, but I didn't realize that world leaders made decisions based on stupid things like jealousy. I imagine, no, they're above that. it's like a weird. Why would I think that? Like if I had read, any number of Dostoevsky's novels, right, at that point, I would have known a lot more, right, about the reality of how people can make very trite decisions, right, and so I think that was part of it. But I ultimately think the reason is what I described earlier, is that it's just there's this foundational non-totalitarian aspect to it, and that it fosters this unusual level of agency among people, and that's just something that communists can't tolerate, because they want submission, right? And you have people that are going to be truthful, right, in the face of being told, and truth in a communist society is what the party says it is. That's just how
It's
they
it's
run.
it's
Yeah.
it's so true, and I want to emphasize that I'm very familiar with the history of communism. I studied political philosophy for my master's degree, and this is what was so terrifying to me about the COVID pandemic response in this country. I just thought, God, this is looking an awful lot like some of these early moves in Russia and in China. And then, of course, this goes to the peculiar character of Mao Zedong. I mean, it seems to me that he would be a good place to start in terms of his psychology, his incompetence. I mean, Mao would just do just crazy stuff. I mean, it's like, let's reverse the flow of this river, or let's dam all of these things, or let's cut all of these forests down. I remember reading um, a study of Mao. He said, I think there's a species of blackbird or starlings, or some kind of large flocking bird. They're eating all of the grain. Let's get a huge army of guys out with shotguns and let's exterminate those infernal starlings. So they did. I mean, it's amazing the way these central guys in China can just let it be done. And so there's a mass extermination campaign of this flocking bird. Well, guess what? The birds eat insects that devour the grain crops. So, talk about, I mean, this isn't even a particularly complex system. I mean, that anybody could have seen that coming. So,
Yeah.
now you have grasshoppers, cicadas, or whatever the bugs are that just completely wipe out the crops. So, do you see a kind of a red thread through the communist regime going back to Chairman Mao?
Um, 100%, right? And I mean, this is something, as we've been talking, it's funny how this discussion has evolved, right? But I keep thinking back to one of my favorite authors, Solzhenitsyn, and he has this I think probably most people will be familiar with the line between good and evil cuts through every human heart. All right. And indeed, that's true. And I think the problem with this system is that it activates the evil part, right? And what we want to have is social systems that activate the good part, right? And I don't know if it's I don't think it's more in some ways more complicated than that. With Mao, it's very interesting. Like I've never thought of it in the way you describe it, right? That these leaders tend to be incredibly incompetent, but they sell it as being unbelievably competent, and everybody has to agree, yes, this is the most competent and most amazing thing, yes sir, and if you suggest anything otherwise, you're in the gulag, right, or worse, right? That's all true. On the issue of like propaganda, the other thing I kept thinking was this. One of the huge pieces of very successful propaganda that lots of Westerners like to parrot, right, is that China lifted millions of people out of poverty under the Communist Party. It's like, yes, okay, there is an element of truth to that, but you forget to mention the part where you drove them to cannibalism first, right? And by doing things like exterminating the sparrows, so one of the ways they did that, they didn't even use shotgun, because that was resources, right? There was shot that would go into the air, and right, they actually would like just they would keep the sparrows in the air until they died of exhaustion by kind of beating the I forget what it is that they were beating, but creating enough sound that the sparrows wouldn't land, right? So they came up with all sorts of crazy ways. This is like, you want to talk about how important incentive structures were, and the horror of perverse incentive structures leading to a situation where people were, and this is unfortunately well documented, making decisions to eat some of their children, and horror, like just a horror show that we can't even fathom, because of the level of poverty which Mao's insane and incompetent, I might add, extremely incompetent policies created. And if, so we again we could we've ended up in a big discussion about communism, but frankly, coming back to the book, that's a big part of the book, is basically using this organ industry as a tool, as a way to understand through different angles, different perspectives, including, I bring in people like Lobachevsky, right? I bring in sort of insights from people like John Lenchowsky, who I think is one of the premier students of communism alive today, former now chancellor, but founder also of the Institute of World Politics, this premier school of diplomacy and statecraft here in Washington, D.C. Reagan's chief Soviet affairs advisor back in the day, very important character. He'll deny it. He's very humble, but incredibly important student of this evil ideology. Today, we still think at some level we're dealing with a normal regime, but this red thread that you're describing, that you asked, right, about coming from Mao, absolutely it's come all the way through, because ultimately in communist societies, the survival and supremacy of the Communist Party. This is from Lenin. This is the brilliant innovation to communism that Lenin brought, right? So-called brilliant, I say that in quotes, is that party supremacy and party survival as the greatest good for the communist society, right? And this is why, that's why you end up with this whole weird utilitarianism, right? Where you're someone who'll be familiar with, when we look at health, for example, right? We have the span of how we approach health. On one end, we have Hippocratic medicine, right? Basically, do no harm. Physician does the absolute best they can for the individual patient with their unique reality, and also try to minimize any harms from any intervention they would use. And that, medicine is just the emergent property of all of these practitioners doing that, right? And that deeply honors the individual dignity of every human being. This in Judeo-Christian societies, Hippocratic medicine makes a ton of sense, and that's one of the reasons I think it's practiced that way. The other side, right, is in this sort of, utopian communist reality, and by the way, we've been flirting with it quite a bit too, right, is utilitarian bioethics, right? It's the greatest good for the greatest number. And I hadn't grasped this part, right, until I was actually writing the book, that, what is I realized there's a very well-known statement that is the epitome of utilitarian bioethics, right? That it's okay to sacrifice a few people as the benevolent, kind of leader, because I'm gonna help basically make sure the health of the many is kept, right? Well, in a communist society, you've heard this, right? To make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. People ascribe that to Joseph Stalin. I heard it might have been Walter Duranty, in fact, that actually said this. There's some debate, okay? But anyway, the point is that in order to achieve our great utopia, right, per Stalin, yeah, we're going to have, maybe a few people have to die in the process. That's perfectly fine. And that's why every communist society, there's atrocity, right? Because
Yes, for there's no doubt. I mean, I would say that every state, some far less than others, but every state to some degree assumes this mentality that for a large, complex industrial society in which we have things like state healthcare, any kind of military calculus that's made of, well, we're going to have to vanquish an enemy abroad. And it's true that a lot of young men are going to die, but they're dying for the greater good. The other thing is, in 1986, with the liability protection granted to vaccine manufacturers, it's, well, we can't make these products completely safe. A certain number of children are going to be injured and killed by them, but we can't afford the liability. So the calculus is vaccines are a national security asset. A certain number of children will have to die for the greater good. So I think this is like Solzhenitsyn observed. I mean, the human heart kind of has these gradations. It's sort of a spectrum of good and evil, and at least in the potentiality of every human heart. The Chinese just seem to have taken this to a very rationalized state centralized level.
I think you mentioned something very interesting. You say when there's a military calculus, and I think that's right. It's not that this kind of thinking has no place ever in any situation. No, it does. In fact, on a battlefield, it has a lot of making sense, okay, so to speak, because I'm on a battlefield. There's a whole bunch of people dying, and I'm the medic, and I have to decide. I can only take 3 guys back because that's all I can do. And you see in the films they're putting the X's on the foreheads and all that. What are they doing? They're playing God because they want to figure they have an impossible situation and they're trying to do the best they can and save the people they can. That makes sense in this sort of situation, but that's not everyday life.
Sure.
In a normal situation, we're not this is not the calculus, and we don't want to think. We never need to think in that kind of calculus. We can go back to thinking, what can I do as a practitioner? I need to understand, what the problem is with my particular patient, their unique biology, their unique psychology, and do the best I can for them in that situation. This sort of, having to pick and choose winners and losers, we don't need to do that. That's just a twisted way of thinking in a non-wartime situation. Okay.
Sure, but I think the state is always the drama and the conflict of us versus them that is exemplified in a military setting. The state loves these scenarios because within the context of that, it enables the state to invoke emergency power or special power and to allocate resources for this so-called emergency. So, I mean, we're constantly seeing the state attempt to wage some kind of war. There's always some enemy that has to be vanquished in the world. And then within the context of society, it could be, well, racism has to be vanquished, or narco terrorists, or there's always some bad guy that the state and the state is always has interest to benefit from this conflict. But anyway, I want to get into something very specific with you. Where is the market for these organs?
Right.
Where is
It's
it?
all over the world. It starts with basically people who have the money and the need. And so unfortunately with organs, there's always a much smaller supply than the demand is, because basically in an ethical system, someone has to have a catastrophic accident, then they have to match you sufficiently. And even with the new anti-rejection drugs that exist today, which make it a bit easier, right? That all has to happen, and that's rare. And so you just have to wait, and sometimes you die without your organ. That's just what happens. I mean, for kidneys, basically half the people, this is about the stat, but half the people by 5 years that go on dialysis pass away, right? So it's like there's a game of statistics at play, right? But now here, if I've got the cash, I can get a new organ in 2 weeks. Basically any organ within a very short period of time. Even if I have a rare condition, rare histology or whatever, I can still make that happen. I have one anecdote. I mean, I have many actually very fascinating anecdotes, which I'm not going to tell you all of them. I encourage you to read the book. Sometimes the anecdotes kind of prove the situation. But in one case, I know of one verified situation where someone was fitted, I kid you not, with 8 different kidneys before the final one took. Okay, it's crazy. Like, it's completely impossible in any ethical scenario. This happened to be a Taiwanese guy that went to China on 2 trips where it was fitted with 4 each time until the 8th one took. So like this sort of stuff can happen in this kind of a monstrous system. But we're talking about the U.S. We're talking about Europe. I have examples from Europe, specific ones there. Basically, a lot of people from South Korea. There was a whole film crew. One of the pieces of evidence, if you will, is a film crew goes into, undercover with the hidden cameras trying to procure organs in China, and they find crazy stuff, and people, sort of admitting to it all happening and so forth. There's many different, I detail all of this in there, all these different kind of I think the most compelling lines of evidence, but there's also the China Tribunal, which really was, kind of 2 years of a People's of Tribunal of independent experts that assessed the whole body of evidence. ChinaTribunal.com for those interested. You can read the whole giant report and and evidence that exists. So,
but if so, let's just say I had a friend who was suffering from heart failure, and he thought, well, okay, what's the and he's got some money, and he thinks, well, what's the fastest way I could get a heart that more or less matches mine? Would he fly to China? Would he fly to Shanghai? Like how? I'm not recommending, or I'm not trying to educate people on how to do this, but how would he find a Chinese harvested organ? Like, how does one find it?
today, typically what I've been told by people in this space is that there's some kind of transplant center that has some people working at it that offer the information. Okay. And I'm aware of this, and I'm not going to name them. So I'm aware of this in a number of transplant centers. The specific European one comes to mind, and other places. So that's one way. Initially, they were literally ads online, but those went underground, probably on the dark web. You can find that. I haven't looked myself. And frankly, I don't know, like, I don't want to be, like you point out, right? I don't want to really be educating people around this. But basically, if you have the cash, which is, I think, the parts, I think, are ranging in that 200. Last, I usually use the term 200. They've ranged quite a bit over the years, just sort of depending on the hospital. But, and I think landing in China, you could probably pretty quickly arrange that, right? Which is exactly what the South Korean film crew did, right? They just kind of showed up and were like, hey, what can we get, right? So again, I hope that no one takes this because this is the problem. They prey on desperate people, right? But you have to understand that if you're a desperate person and don't want to die, you don't want someone else to be dying, being killed to order for your new organ. So really, like, we really need to, this is one of the things I talk about in there too. There's a lot of things we can do. Like, for example, we can stop training Chinese transplant surgeons. We do that. Not all of them, but some of them. There's no reason for us to do that. There's no reason for us to supply technologies, a whole range of things, technologies that involved in the transplant industry in China. There's funding and research partnerships. There's all sorts of things that we can stop. At the very least, what we can do, right, at this point, and I think we can do a lot more. There's all this legislation that's happening. It's actually unprecedented levels, both at the state and federal levels of legislation that is like ready to be passed. Some of it has passed the House in Congress near unanimously, right? To actually, we'll take a bite out of this. Maybe not all of it, of course, but a bite out of it. This is kind of all happening, but we just don't want to be participating in this. The Chinese Communist Party has been incredibly effective at making Americans and other Westerners complicit in its nastiness in all sorts of ways, and that's also a bit of how it buys, kind of buys the buy-in or the justification or the quiet around horrific things like forced organ harvesting. Now, John, before you jump in, I have to jump off fairly soon. Just
Okay.
FYI.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah. So I beg your pardon that we got into perhaps slightly off track with the conversation about communism, the utilitarian thinking.
It's a central part of the book, John. You're right. I think you're right on the money. I mean, you went beyond the book even in this area. So I'm thrilled to talk to you about it.
Well, the book is great, and I want to exhort all of our audience of the Focal Points to pick up a copy. Let's make it a New York Times bestseller when it goes live. Jan, when does it go live?
It's March 17th. But the other thing I wanted to do for anyone that's in the DC area or anywhere around the DC area, Virginia, Maryland, there's actually a book opening we're doing the day before the official book publication date, March 16th, 6 p.m. at Trump Kennedy Center, okay, what used to be called the Kennedy Center. And the way it's played out, they're actually running it as an official Millennium Stage event of the Trump Kennedy Center. And it's going to be a conversation between me and Rob Schneider, who has decided to it's become a very important issue to him. Thank goodness. I'm very honored by that. So we're going to have a conversation, a little bit of dark humor in there too, about this issue. And we have space for the first 1,000 people, thanks to a very generous donor who's also a big supporter of this issue. The first 1,000 people that get in the room get a book as well. So, and it's going to be on the 16th at 6 p.m. at Trump Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., one of the premier venues in America. And I'm just honored to have that opportunity. But I actually think we can, kind of create a little bit of a movement around this. I think the book, as you know, is quite readable. It's not an academic thing. It's really for anybody who just who's ready to understand one of the darkest issues that in our world right now, and also like how we can at least stop our own complicity. I have a whole appendix about what you can do, whether you're a federal legislator, a state legislator, just a regular person on the street, whatever area you're in, there's really good options to actually make a difference.
Well, excellent, Jan. That sounds extremely exciting. And thank you for talking to me and my audience. You are, after all, America's only newspaper reporter. So best luck with the book, and stay in touch.
Thank you so much, John.
And until the next time. Okay.
So